Frederick had been home 6 weeks when he said it, and the way he said it told Eleonora everything she needed to understand about who he had come back as from the war. He did not look up from his plate. He was eating with the efficient focus he had brought to every meal since August, as though food were a task to be completed, rather than any kind of pleasure, and he said, "The matter of an heir." He paused to take a drink of water. He said that with Leopold and Ernst gone, the responsibility for the family line rested entirely with this branch of the family. He mentioned a doctor in Vienna whose remedies had shown results in similar cases. He spoke for 3 minutes without warmth and without hesitation, and when he was finished, he picked up his fork and continued eating. Eleonora set down her wineglass with great care. She looked at a point on the wall just to the left of his head and said yes, she understood, and she agreed that it was important. Her voice came out exactly as she intended it to, which is to say it came out giving nothing away at all. Because what she felt in her chest at that moment was something so large and so sudden that it surprised her with its size. She had not known until that precise moment how completely she had been waiting. Across 6 weeks of suppers and estate conversations, and perfectly managed appearances, for him to ask how she was. He had not asked. Not once. Not in 6 weeks. And not in the weeks before he arrived home, when the letters between them had been functional and brief, and concerned with practical matters. And now this was what he had to say, at last, about their marriage. The matter of an heir. She ate her supper. She answered the things he said. She excused herself at the correct hour, and walked through the house, with the measured step of someone who has decided not to run, and is carrying that decision with great effort, through every corridor and staircase, until she reached the east wing, and the door of her room, and the privacy that waited on the other side of it. She sat by the window in the dark and looked at the mountains, which she could not see but knew the shape of, and she allowed herself for exactly 20 minutes to feel every single thing she was feeling, without management or restraint. Then she folded it up, the way you fold a document that cannot be dealt with tonight, and she lay down, and eventually, very late, she slept. He had not always been this man. That was the thing she kept returning to in the weeks that followed, the question she turned over, with the precision she brought to every question worth thinking about carefully. The Frederick she had married in 1905 had been a formal man, but not a cold one. He had sought her opinion on things, and had listened to the answers, genuinely listened, not merely waited for the sound to finish before speaking himself. On their 2nd anniversary, he had arranged a journey to Venice, for no reason she had been given, except that she had once mentioned in passing, months before, that she had always wanted to see it. He had remembered, and he had arranged it, and he had said nothing about it until the morning they were to leave, when he had simply appeared at her door, with her coat over his arm, and told her they had a train to catch. That man had existed. She had not invented him. What the war had done to Frederick was something she had tried to understand over the weeks since his return, and what she had arrived at was this: it had made him efficient. Not the warm and human kind of efficient, the kind that makes people reach toward one another in a crisis, but the cold institutional kind, the kind that builds a wall between itself and anything that cannot be measured or put to use. He had come back from the front thinner and quieter and permanently tight somewhere behind his eyes, and the thing he had lost was not his sanity or his capacity to function. He functioned perfectly. He functioned better than most men could, under the pressure of what the estate required. But his ability to treat things that could not be put to practical use, as things that still mattered. Eleonora, she gradually understood, was a function. The house was a function. The continuation of the name was a function. Everything else had been cleared away. The staff felt it, without being able to name it. Edmund, who had managed the Harstein estate for 20 years, and who processed information with the quiet precision of a man who has learned to read weather in a stone room, observed the change the way he observed everything, through accumulated evidence and careful patience. He said nothing to anyone. That was not his role. But he noticed that the Duchess moved through the house, in the early months after the Duke's return, with an expression that she kept very flat and very composed in company, and that occasionally, in the gap between one room and the next when she was not aware of being observed, something entirely different crossed her face. He gave her, in the subtle language of a man who respects someone deeply and cannot say so directly, every courtesy and accommodation within his authority to give. Clara gave her something more direct. Clara had been with Eleonora for 8 years, and had developed, across those years, a complete parallel language, conducted entirely through expression and posture, that Eleonora could read as clearly as printed text. What Clara communicated daily, in rooms where no one else could see, was this: I see everything. I agree with your assessment completely, and I am entirely on your side. She communicated this without ever speaking a word that could be repeated to anyone, which was both extremely competent and deeply comforting. Agnes, the cook, expressed her allegiances through food, which was the only language she required. The quality and generosity of the meals she prepared for Eleonora's private table on the evenings Frederick chose his study over the dining room, and those evenings grew more frequent through the autumn, was a form of protest and a form of affection simultaneously. There was always something extra, something particular and good, that said more plainly than words, "You deserve better than this, and I know it, and here is what I am able to do about it." The first loss came in February 1919. Frederick was in Vienna. He had been there for 9 days, attending meetings with financial advisors about the estate's deteriorating situation, a situation Eleonora had been reading through the weight of the correspondence envelopes and the particular set of his jaw on certain mornings for several months. She had already been unwell for a few days before it happened. Her body told her the story her mind did not want to hear. She sent for Herbert, the doctor from the village, on a Tuesday afternoon, and by evening, he had confirmed what she had already known. Clara was there through all of it. She had come without being asked, simply appeared at the chamber door that Tuesday evening, with the look of someone who had already assessed the situation and decided their presence was non-negotiable. She sat through both nights in the chair by the bed, without sleeping, and without making a performance of her wakefulness, periodically adjusting the cold cloths, and bringing tea, and being present, in the way that some people simply know how to be present, without intrusion, and without withdrawal, at the exact correct distance. On the second morning, Herbert sat by the bed and told Eleonora it was over. He said he was sorry, in a voice that was genuine rather than professional. He held her hand briefly, which was more warmth than she had anticipated from him, and left. Clara sat with her through the rest of that day. Very little was said. Clara understood that words in such situations were most often unhelpful and occasionally harmful, and that presence itself was the thing, and she provided it without ornamentation. Toward the evening, when Eleonora appeared to be sleeping, Clara got up from the chair and went to the far end of the east wing corridor. Eleonora heard her, through the door she had left slightly open, crying quietly. The specific quiet of someone who is crying for someone else and does not wish to be heard doing it. Eleonora had not been sleeping. She heard every moment of it. There is a particular grace in discovering that someone else is grieving for you when you have not permitted yourself to grieve for yourself. It breaks something open that propriety and necessity have been holding closed. She turned her face into the pillow and allowed herself everything she had been withholding, and she wept until there was nothing left, and then she lay still and listened to the house. And then, very late, she slept. Frederick came home 4 days later. Eleonora told him what had happened while he was still in his traveling coat in the doorway of his study. He turned and looked at her with an expression that was not without feeling. She was precise about this in the journal entry she wrote about it later, and said that he was sorry. He asked whether the doctor had offered any explanation. She said not yet. He said that when she had recovered her strength, there would be time to address the matter again. He said it in the voice of a man who believes he is being both practical and kind, and who does not understand that those are not the same thing, and that what she needed from him in that moment had nothing to do with practicality. He did not ask how she was. He did not ask what it had been like. He did not put his hand on her arm. She went back to her room. She did not write that evening. Sometimes you simply carry it. The year of 1919 was the year Eleonora began to understand the marriage as it actually was, rather than as she had been choosing to see it. The distinction was important. She had not been deluded, exactly. She had been choosing, actively and with full awareness of the choice, to look at the more favorable evidence and hold it in front of the less favorable evidence, the way you hold a lamp in front of a shadow. She had done this because she needed the marriage to be workable, and because she had believed, right up until Frederick's return, that it was. Now she was removing the lamp and looking at what was actually there. What was there was a man who had married her for the right reasons in 1905. Genuine admiration, compatible temperament, a real, if formal affection, and who had been available to those right reasons for the first several years. and who had then been stripped by the war, and by grief, and by financial pressure, into something that was no longer interested in reasons. The estate needed an heir. He needed someone to manage the household and appear at the necessary occasions. He needed a Duchess of Harstein. He did not, at this point, particularly need Eleonora. She began keeping a journal in the cedar box that summer. Not a diary of events, but something more purposeful. Something more like the careful accumulation of evidence by someone who already knows the verdict and is making sure the record is complete. She wrote about what she observed, and what she felt about it, and what it meant. She wrote with precision, and without self-pity, which was not a suppression of feeling, but a choice to be accurate rather than dramatic, because accuracy was more useful to her than drama. She also wrote, for the first time that autumn, about her mother's money. The Romanian trust her mother had left her predated the marriage. It had been left in Eleonora's name specifically, in a manner that her mother's solicitor, Mr. Aldridge in Bucharest, had described at the time as a provision for her personal security. Through some oversight in the rush of a wartime marriage, or perhaps through some design of her mother's that she had never explained, the funds had never been formally transferred into the Harstein estate accounts. They remained in Eleonora's name. They were hers. She had confirmed this 3 times over the course of the autumn, through careful letters to Mr. Aldridge, letters she sent and received through the village post office rather than the estate's own mail arrangements. A small precaution that she had adopted without fully examining why, until the day she recognized it as the first step of something larger. The second loss came in November 1919. She had been further along this time, far enough that she had allowed a name to form in her mind, not spoken, not decided, just a soft and private possibility she turned over in the late evenings in her chair. She had told no one except Clara and Herbert, because she had learned from February that other people's hope becomes another weight you carry, and she had been carrying quite enough. Frederick was in the house when it happened. He was told by a note that George carried to his study at supper, because Eleonora had asked Clara to tell him, and then found, when the actual moment approached, that she could not be in the same room for his response. She did not trust her own face. He came to her room that evening. He sat in the chair by the window. He looked at her, with what she would later describe in the journal as effortful attention, the specific expression of a man who has recognized this as a situation that requires his presence, and is applying his presence deliberately, as a duty. He said he was sorry. He said it had been a very difficult period. He said she should rest. He stayed 25 minutes and did not once reach toward her. When he left, the door made almost no sound at all, and she noted this without knowing why it mattered, but certain that it did. She wrote for nearly 3 hours that night. She wrote everything she had been holding at arm's length for the past year, wrote it out fully, and let it stand, and looked at it clearly. She wrote about the gap between what love was supposed to do for a person and what it had done for her. She wrote about Leopold, who had always asked questions about her reading, and remembered her answers, and built on them the next time they spoke, which was the behavior of a man who thought of her as a person with an interior life that was genuinely interesting. She wrote carefully about the question she had been circling for months, whether what she had taken for warmth in Frederick in the early years of their marriage had been real, or whether it had been the specific warmth of courtship, which was a performance that ended at the altar, and left something colder and more permanent in its place. She reached no conclusion that night, but she was asking the right questions, and in the morning, she locked the box and faced the day with perfect composure, which was, she understood, both her greatest skill and her most exhausting one. Through the winter of 1919 into 1920, Frederick ate in his study 3 or 4 evenings a week. His reason, when he offered one, was always the correspondence, the accounts, the estate requirements that would not wait. Eleonora ate at the dining table alone, with the composure of someone accustomed to it, and spoke to George and to Agnes with the attention they deserved, because they were people doing real work, and she believed that deserved acknowledgement. Agnes sent something extra to the table on these evenings. Eleonora received it, and understood it, and was grateful for it, in the way you are grateful for kindness, that comes with no conditions attached. The news about Vienna reached Eleonora through Clara, on a Tuesday morning, in March 1920. Clara delivered it with apology and care, in the privacy of the sitting room, in a low and measured voice. A woman had been seen with Frederick more than once at lunch near the financial district. The manner between them, as described by a mutual acquaintance, was familiar in a way that went past professional. Eleonora received this information seated, with her hands flat on her embroidery, her spine straight, her face arranged into absolute composure. She thanked Clara. She asked 2 specific questions, received their answers, and said she would need an hour. Clara left. In the hour that followed, Eleonora reached for the cedar box. She wrote for 3 hours, without pause or erasure, in the fast, certain hand of someone who has finally stopped arguing with what they know. She did not write about Frederick or the woman. She wrote about herself, about what she had, what she could use, what remained possible. She wrote down the figures Mr. Aldridge had given her. She wrote down what she knew about Dorothy's contact in Zurich. She wrote about the apartment Dorothy had once mentioned in passing, 2 summers ago at a gathering Eleonora had attended alone. She wrote it all like an inventory, like a plan, like the first page of something she was going to build properly. She wrote, "I am not going to wait for him to change." Then she wrote, "I know what I am going to do." She locked the box. She rang for Clara. She drank her afternoon tea with absolute composure and felt, for the first time in as long as she could remember, something in her chest that was not grief or endurance, but something closer to purpose. The third loss came in October 1920, and it was the last. She had not told Frederick about that pregnancy at all. The decision had been made quietly, somewhere in the weeks after she had written those 2 lines. A decision that arrived not with drama, but with the simple clarity of a thing that is true. The child was hers in a way that his knowledge could not help, and his indifference would only damage, and so she had kept it to herself, and gone through the hard week of it, with Clara and Herbert. And when it was over, the grief was different, cleaner, not entangled with hope, or with the ache of what he would or would not do. Just grief itself, standing alone, which is survivable, which is, in its own quiet way, clarifying. On the 3rd day, she got up and wrote to Dorothy. She asked about the flat in Zurich. She asked about the banking arrangements, about travel documents, about establishing oneself quietly in a new city under a maiden name. She asked specific, practical, intelligent questions. The questions of a woman who has been thinking about this for a long time, and is now prepared to act on it. She sealed the letter and gave it to Clara with one instruction: post it from the village. Clara asked nothing. Dorothy wrote back inside a week. The flat was available. Everything was possible. Dorothy's last line said, "I have been hoping for 2 years that you would write this letter." Eleonora read it twice and locked it in the cedar box and stood by the east wing window and looked at the mountains going gold in the autumn light and felt something ease in her chest that she had not known, until that moment, was still tightened. It was the easing that comes, not when a problem is solved, but when you understand, completely and without remaining doubt, that you are the one who is going to solve it. She had approximately 1 year. She began that afternoon. Eleonora had been planning for 14 months before the dinner, and in all that time she had not once allowed herself to move faster than was safe, or to want it done so badly that she made an error. The discipline required was extraordinary, and she knew it, and she applied it the way she applied every discipline that had ever mattered to her, which was completely and without complaint, and without ever letting anyone see the effort. By November 1920, the first transfer of funds from the Romanian trust to the Zurich account had been completed. Mr. Aldridge had managed it with the discretion of a man who had been handling the private financial arrangements of careful women for decades, and who understood, without being told, that discretion was not a courtesy in this case but a necessity. His confirming letter arrived folded inside what appeared to be a letter about estate business from a Bucharest firm, addressed to Eleonora in her capacity as the Duchess, which was an arrangement she had requested and which he had managed without any visible surprise. She read it and burned it in the East Wing sitting room fireplace on a gray November morning, watching the paper turn to ash with the attention of someone making sure the job is complete. In December, she had written to the organization in Paris. She had found them through a journal article in early 1920, a piece about the expansion of secular women's education across France and Switzerland, and she had kept the journal in the cedar box for months before she was ready to use it. She wrote to them as Eleonora Vasile, describing herself as an educated woman with experience in literature and languages who would be relocating to France in the spring. She wrote in French, which she spoke well, and in a tone that was confident without being arrogant, the tone of someone who has real things to offer and knows it without needing to insist on it. The response had been warm, A further exchange followed in January, and by February, a woman named Catherine, who ran an academy for young women in Lyon, had written to her directly, saying she had read her qualifications with interest, and that if her plans brought her to the city, she would very much like to discuss a teaching position. Catherine's letter was brisk and intelligent and practical, and Eleonora had read it 3 times and felt, for the first time in many years, the specific pleasure of being addressed as a capable person by another capable person who expected nothing from her except her capability. The travel documents had been arranged in January, through Dorothy's contact in Zurich, a man Dorothy had declined to describe further than necessary, whose efficiency was complete and whose asking price had been both reasonable and non-negotiable. The documents listed her as Eleonora Vasile, widow, Romanian origin. They were excellent work. She stored them in the cedar box from the day they arrived, delivered by Dorothy's courier, in a plain envelope addressed in Dorothy's own handwriting, indistinguishable to any outside observer from personal correspondence between cousins. The apartment in Lyon had been confirmed in February, a ground-floor flat in a quiet street near Catherine's academy, available from the 1st of April. Dorothy had arranged it through Catherine's contact. The rent was manageable against the funds in Zurich. The key had arrived by the same courier, in the same manner. The key was in the cedar box. In the second week of March 1921, Eleonora wrote the letter to Frederick. It took 4 drafts. The first draft was too angry. Not hysterically angry, not cruel, but there was a sharpness in certain sentences that she recognized as the sharpness of a woman who had been accumulating injury for years and was now, in the privacy of a blank page, not managing it. She read it through once and burned it without hesitation. Anger was true, but it was not the whole truth, and she owed him the whole truth. She was not doing this to wound him. She was doing it because she had no other choice that was compatible with remaining herself. The second draft was too careful. She had overcorrected from the anger and produced something that sounded like a legal document, a formal statement of facts without a person inside it. She burned that one the following evening. The third draft was closer. It had warmth in the right places and clarity in the rest, and the ending was almost right. But she read it twice and found one paragraph where the honesty went soft, at the precise point where it should have been most direct, where she had flinched from saying the thing most clearly, and she recognized the flinching as a failure of nerve and burned that draft as well. The fourth draft she wrote in 3 hours, on the evening of the 12th of March, in the East Wing sitting room, with the fire burning down and a glass of wine she barely touched, and the cedar box open beside her on the side table. She wrote quickly, and without going back, trusting the 14 months of thinking and the years of clear observation to produce the right words without excessive deliberation. She wrote to Frederick the man, not to the Duke, and she used his name the way you use someone's name when you are speaking to them directly, as a human being, from close range. She wrote the love first, because it was true, and because she wanted him to know it was true, before he read anything else. Then she wrote what loving him had cost, not as accusation, but as account, as a clear-eyed record of what had happened between 2 people who had begun with real feeling and had arrived, by the machinery of his choices and her endurance, at a place that was no longer bearable for one of them. She named the 3 losses. She described each one briefly and without ornament. She described what she had needed and what she had not received. She mentioned the woman in Vienna once, in one sentence, with neither cruelty nor false forgiveness, simply as a fact that had been part of her final understanding. She described what she was going to do, not where she was going, but what. She said she was going to teach. She said she was going to live somewhere, as Eleonora Vasile, and not anybody's Duchess, and that this was not a diminishment, but an enlargement. She said she hoped he would not look for her, but that if he did, she would not be found. The last line came to her with the certainty of something that had been waiting to be written for a long time. She wrote it and read it back and knew it was right. She sealed the letter and wrote Frederick across the front of the envelope, in her ordinary everyday handwriting, not her formal hand. His name alone. She put the letter in the cedar box. The task of arranging the carriage had fallen to Arthur, who had worked the Schloss Harstein grounds for 30 years, and who was, in Eleonora's estimation, a man whose primary characteristic was that he did what he said he would do, and did not make performances of it. She had spoken to him on a Sunday morning in the kitchen garden, where their conversation would look from any window like a discussion about the spring planting. She told him she needed the smaller carriage at the east gate by 3 o'clock in the morning on the 15th of March, with a driver she could trust to take her to the railway station without speaking about it afterward. She looked at him directly when she said it. He looked back at her. He said he would arrange it, and named his young nephew Henry as the driver, who was reliable and would not talk. That was the extent of the conversation. The last 10 days before the dinner Eleonora spent in a state of performance so complete and so sustained that she impressed herself with it. She attended every social requirement the estate placed on her. She managed the household accounts with her customary efficiency. She was pleasant and engaged at meals. She asked Frederick intelligent questions about his correspondence and listened to the answers. She gave nothing away. Not once, not for a second, not to anyone except Clara, who knew everything and said nothing, whose only communication on the subject was a single look exchanged one morning in the corridor that conveyed everything that needed to be said. On the morning of the 14th, Eleonora made her bed with careful hands, smoothing the coverlet with more attention than was strictly necessary. She thought about the woman who had made this bed each morning for 16 years, what that woman had believed, and hoped for, and managed, and endured. She felt something for that woman that was not quite pity, and not quite pride, but something in between, a recognition, a tenderness. Clara came to her late that morning. They sat together in the East Wing sitting room, and drank tea, and talked about things that were beside the point. And at the end of an hour, Clara took Eleonora's hand in both of her own, and held it for a moment with the grip of someone trying to transfer through contact everything that cannot be put into language. Then she released it, stood, smoothed her dress, and left without looking back. Eleonora sat still for a few minutes after she was gone. Then she stood, straightened her collar, and went downstairs to oversee the preparations for the evening. The dinner was for 8, 4 neighbors and their wives, invited a month ago as part of the ordinary social rotation that the estate maintained. Eleonora had chosen her dress with deliberate thought. The deep blue silk that Frederick had always said suited her particularly well. She had considered this choice carefully, and decided it was neither cruelty nor performance, but simply the right thing, the correct final image, and that the precision of the gesture was between her and herself, and was therefore exactly right. She was genuinely present at that dinner, in a way she had not been truly present anywhere in many years. Not performing presence but actually feeling it, every exchange, every face, every moment of the evening as it passed. She asked questions, and listened to the answers with real attention. She drew out the quieter guests, with the instinct of someone who has always known how a room works. She made a remark about a recent political matter that was so precisely apt and so lightly delivered that the man beside her laughed with real pleasure. She poured Frederick's wine herself, which was a small intimacy she allowed herself, not for him, but for the part of herself that had loved him for real in the years when that had been possible and uncomplicated. Frederick was in a good mood. William had apparently been useful company the previous evening, and Frederick arrived home with more warmth than he had shown in some time. He was more present at the table, more inclined to look across and meet her eyes, and give the slight smile that had once been more common between them. She met it, she returned it, she meant it. That was perhaps the most complex thing about the entire evening. The warmth she showed him was not a lie. The love had not left her. It had simply been insufficient to outweigh everything else, which was not the same thing as being false. The guests departed at 10:15. Frederick thanked her for the evening, with the specific directness he used when he had genuinely noticed something well done. She said it had been a pleasure. He said good night. He went to his wing. She went to the East Wing sitting room and poured herself a glass of the wine that had not been finished at dinner, and she sat in her chair by the window and drank slowly and looked at the mountains in the dark, which she could not see but knew perfectly. She stayed there until the house had gone entirely and completely silent, until even the last sound of the staff settling for the night had dissolved into the stone walls. Then she got up. She took the letter from the cedar box. She walked to the writing desk and placed it in the exact center, the cream envelope with Frederick written on the front in her hand, the name alone. She adjusted it once, so it was precisely centered on the cleared surface. Then she removed her hand. She picked up the cedar box. She went to her wardrobe and took down the coat she had set aside 2 days before. She put it on. She picked up the bag. She opened the east wing door. The night air was cold and clean, and smelled of pine, and the particular mineral quality of high-altitude air that she had breathed every morning for 16 years. She stood in the doorway for one breath, and took it in with full and deliberate attention. The carriage was at the east gate. Henry was on the box. He said nothing when she approached, which was exactly right. He helped her in with steady hands, and she settled on the seat with the cedar box in her lap, her hands around it. The gate opened. The carriage moved. The road fell away beneath them, and the estate was swallowed by the first curve of the mountain road, and she did not look back. Not because the looking back was more than she could stand, but because she had already looked at everything she needed to look at, had already taken into herself every part of Schloss Harstein that she wanted to carry. The looking was complete. This was simply the physical act that followed. Henry drove without a word. The mountains were enormous in the dark. The first pale suggestion of dawn was beginning somewhere to the east, a lightening of the sky that had nothing yet to do with color. She was on her way. Frederick woke at 5:20 and did not know why. He lay still for a moment in the dark, listening. The house was quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of a household asleep, which has its own textures, the small adjustments of beams, the distant sounds of a large building occupied by sleeping people, the particular resonance of a well-run estate in the pre-dawn, but a different kind of quiet, a thinner quiet, the quiet of a space from which something essential has been removed without notice. He lay still with this sensation for perhaps 2 minutes, which was not something he had ever done. He was not a man who lay still with sensations. He was a man who identified a problem and moved toward it. But the quality of what he was feeling now was strange enough that it held him in the bed for 2 full minutes, which was 2 minutes longer than anything had held him in bed since the war. Then he got up. He put on his dressing gown and his shoes, not because he had consciously decided to, but because his hands had done it, while his mind was occupied with the particular quality of the silence. He went out into the corridor. He stood there for a moment. The house was perfectly still. The long hallway stretched in both directions, the windows at the far end showing the earliest suggestion of pre-dawn gray in the sky above the mountains. He walked toward the east wing. He could not have explained what was pulling him in that direction. He had not been to the east wing in weeks, possibly months. There was no practical reason to go there now. But the quality of the silence felt as though it was originating from that part of the house specifically, a kind of direction to the absence, and so he followed it. He passed the library. He passed the door to the small sitting room Eleonora used for her correspondence. He passed the linen cupboard and the second staircase. He turned the corner. Eleonora's chamber door was standing open. Not ajar. Open. All the way. Pressed against the wall. The room beyond it caught the first gray light of the pre-dawn, in the way a room does when its curtains are pushed back, which was wrong, because Eleonora's curtains were never open at this hour. He stopped in the doorway. The bed was made. Not made in the middle of the night sense of covers pulled up by someone who had gotten up and not returned. Made. The coverlet was smooth, the pillows correctly arranged. The entire surface of the bed had the appearance of something prepared with deliberate care. It was the state the bed was in every morning at 9 o'clock, after the maids had attended to it, except that it was 5:20, and no maids had yet come upstairs. Frederick stood in the doorway for a moment that was difficult to measure. Then he walked into the room. Her dressing table was clear. This registered as wrong, before he could analyze why. And then he analyzed it. The personal objects that lived on its surface. The silver brush set his mother had given her. The small photograph of her mother in its standing frame. The glass bottle of the French scent she wore. Were gone. Not arranged differently. Gone. He opened her wardrobe. It was not empty. Several dresses hung on the rail, shoes on the shelf below, boxes stacked on the upper shelf as they always were. But there were gaps. He had not known he knew the contents of her wardrobe well enough to identify gaps. He knew it now. He turned back to the room. He stood in the center of it and turned slowly, and what he was doing, he understood dimly, was looking for the cedar box. He was not sure when he had become aware of the cedar box as a specific object whose presence or absence would tell him something, but he was aware of it now. He looked at the place under the window seat where she had kept it. He looked at the shelf beside the fireplace. He looked under the bed. The cedar box was not in the room. He went to the sitting room. He checked the shelf where she kept her correspondence materials. He checked the writing desk. He stopped at the writing desk. On its surface, which was clear of everything else, there was a cream envelope placed in the exact center. His name was written across the front of it in Eleonora's handwriting. Not his title, not his full name with the family designation. Just Frederick. He stood looking at it. He did not touch it yet. He stood with his hands at his sides in his dressing gown in the pre-dawn quiet of his wife's sitting room, and looked at his name written on a cream envelope that had been placed precisely in the center of a cleared surface, and his body understood something that his mind had not yet been willing to formulate. His hands, when he finally reached for the envelope, were shaking. He had not had shaking hands since the war. He had been quietly proud of this. In the private way a man is proud of something he never says aloud. The war had not given him shaking hands. 20 years of financial pressure and family responsibility and the management of a deteriorating estate had not given him shaking hands. His own name written on an envelope in his wife's handwriting gave him shaking hands at 5:20 in the morning of the 15th of March 1921, before he had opened it, before he had read a single word inside. He was still holding it when George appeared in the doorway. George was 22 and possessed the sense, immediately and without being told, that he had walked into something requiring him to be invisible. He went very still in the doorway, with the expression of a young man who has learned that the most useful thing a person in his position can sometimes do is to take up no space at all. Frederick heard him and turned. He looked at George for a moment without speaking. Then he said, in a voice that was entirely controlled and entirely unlike his usual voice, in some way that George could not have described and never forgot, "Go and find Edmund. Tell him I need him in the East Wing study. Tell him to come quietly." George left without a word. Frederick put the envelope inside his dressing gown, against his chest. He went to the window of the sitting room and looked out at the estate. The grounds below were just beginning to emerge from the dark in the first thin gray of the morning. The kitchen garden, the stone walls, the east gate in the distance. He stood and looked at the east gate for a moment longer than he looked at anything else. Edmund arrived 7 minutes later, fully dressed, which told Frederick that Edmund had been awake, or had dressed with extraordinary speed, or both. He came into the sitting room quietly and stood just inside the door, with the manner of a man who has arrived at a situation he has been expecting for some time and is ready to be useful in whatever way is required. Frederick said, "The Duchess has left." Edmund said nothing. He looked at Frederick with an expression that was not surprise. This also told Frederick something, and the something it told him landed in his chest like a stone dropping into deep water, falling and falling, without yet finding the bottom. He said, "When did the carriage go out?" Edmund said he would find out. He left. Frederick stood in the East Wing sitting room for 5 minutes alone. He stood very still, which was a thing he almost never did, and looked at the wall opposite him, and the wall told him nothing useful. Edmund returned with Arthur, who came in holding his hat in his hands, and his face arranged into the careful neutrality of a man who has been asked a direct question by his employer, and is going to answer it honestly, and accept whatever comes of that. Arthur said, "The small carriage, at 3:30 this morning. Henry driving, the railway station." Frederick asked if he had known in advance. Arthur looked at him steadily. He said, "Yes." Frederick said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you, Arthur," and Arthur left. Edmund waited. Frederick could feel Edmund waiting, the particular quality of his stillness, the complete readiness to do whatever was required, without any imposition of his own reactions onto the situation. It was one of the qualities he had always valued in Edmund, and he valued it now, with a precision he had not previously experienced. He said, "I need you to find out which train she could have reached from the station at that hour, and where it was headed. I need to know this morning." Edmund said he would have the information within the hour. He left. Frederick returned to his own wing. He went to his study. He sat down in the chair at his desk, the chair he sat in when he worked, and he took the cream envelope out from inside his dressing gown and put it on the desk in front of him. He looked at his name on the front of it, written in the handwriting he had been reading for 16 years, and he put his 2 hands flat on the desk on either side of it, and breathed. His heart was doing something he was not familiar with it doing. Not a physical irregularity, exactly, but a quality of sustained pressure that was new, a weight behind the sternum that seemed to have arrived fully formed in the past 30 minutes, and showed no indication of lifting. He had been in 2 battles during the war, real battles with real artillery, and he had been genuinely afraid then, in the specific physical way that fear makes itself known in a man's body when his survival is not certain. He had managed it. He had done what was required, and had not shaken. He was shaking now. He told himself it was the cold. He was in a dressing gown, and the morning was early, and the fire in his study had not yet been lit. It was entirely plausible that the shaking was the cold. He almost believed it. He did not open the envelope. He was not ready. He understood this about himself without anything like shame. He was a man who could identify his own limits under pressure without embarrassment, which was something the war had given him. And he understood that whatever was in this envelope required him to be more composed than he was at this moment, in his dressing gown, in the pre-dawn cold of a study with no fire lit, with his hands shaking for the first time in years. He got up. He went to the door of his study and told the footman standing in the corridor to light the fires throughout his wing and to have coffee brought. He went back to his desk. He put the envelope in the center drawer, where it would be out of his direct line of sight but within reach. He sat and waited for the fire and the coffee and Edmund's return, and for the morning to become sufficiently morning that he was ready to do what could not be delayed much longer. His housekeeper, Grace, appeared at the door. She had managed the domestic operations of Schloss Harstein for 12 years with remarkable efficiency, and her face, when she appeared at this early hour, showed a careful blankness that told him she already knew. Word had moved through the household. In a large establishment, news of this kind moved through stone walls. He said, "Make no announcements to anyone outside this house about the Duchess's absence. If anyone asks, she is unwell and keeping to her rooms." Grace said yes, and withdrew. He drank his coffee. He ate nothing. Edmund returned at 7 in the morning with the train information. The overnight from the nearest station had departed at 5:47 and was headed toward Zurich. Frederick listened to this without visible expression. He thanked Edmund and told him to arrange for a reliable contact in Zurich to be reached. Edmund wrote this down and left. Frederick opened the center drawer. He took out the envelope. He put it back on the desk in front of him. He looked at it for a long moment. Outside the windows, the morning had fully arrived, gray and cold and completely indifferent. Below in the courtyard, he could hear the sounds of the household beginning its day, the ordinary sounds of a Thursday morning at Schloss Harstein, sounds that had nothing in them to indicate that anything in the world had changed overnight. The coffee was still warm in the cup. He looked at the envelope. He looked at the fire that was now burning in the grate. He looked back at the envelope. He picked it up and broke the seal. The letter was 4 pages long. He could see this the moment he removed it from the envelope and unfolded it. The cream paper in Eleonora's measured handwriting. 4 complete pages, both sides of 2 sheets, the writing as even and considered as everything she had ever written. He could see that it was 4 pages. He did not yet read it. He looked at the first page for a moment, not reading, simply looking at it as a physical object in his hands. The handwriting was not rushed. It was not distressed. It was exactly like her handwriting on any correspondence she had ever produced, precise, composed, showing no effort. He understood now, with a clarity he wished had come to him earlier, that the composure she put into everything had never been the absence of effort, but the complete mastery of it. She had always been working enormously hard. He had never noticed, because she had never permitted him to notice. The coffee on his desk had gone cold. He had not noticed this either. He read the first sentence. He stopped. He read it again. He set the page down on the desk and stood up. He walked to the window and stood looking out at the courtyard below, where George was crossing from the east door to the kitchen, with his head bent against the cold morning wind, the ordinary business of the household, and he stood there for perhaps 3 full minutes, looking at George crossing the courtyard, without seeing him at all. Then he went back to the desk and sat down, and picked up the first page again. The first sentence was this: "Frederick, I want to begin with what is true, and what has always been true, which is that I have loved you." Past tense. The past tense of it stopped him the same way it had stopped him the first time he read it. Not because it was unexpected. He had understood, in the East Wing chamber 2 hours ago, with the made bed, and the empty dressing table, and the cream envelope placed precisely on the cleared desk, that he was not reading a letter from someone planning to return. He had understood the nature of what this was before he had opened anything. The past tense was not a surprise. It stopped him because it was stated as a fact, without argument or defense or apology. the way she stated everything she believed to be absolutely true, and because the fact of it, "I have loved you," landed in his chest with a weight he was not prepared for. He put the first page back down on the desk and did not pick it up again for 11 minutes. He spent those 11 minutes looking at the surface of his desk. He was not thinking in any organized way. He was more accurately described as absorbing, which was a different thing. The thing that happens when information is too significant to process immediately, and the mind sits with it the way water sits with something heavy, until the settling happens on its own. He had not believed she would go. He understood now that he had known, in some part of himself that he had not been in the habit of attending to, for some time, that the marriage was not what it had once been. He was not a stupid man. He had noticed the separate wings and the evenings she ate alone, and the particular flatness of her expression when she looked at him across the dining table on the occasions he came to the table. He had noticed these things, and had placed them in the category of things that would resolve themselves in time, that required no immediate action, that were part of the natural adjustment of a long marriage, finding its way through difficult years. He had not believed she would simply go. He had not believed it because it had not occurred to him as a real possibility, as something that was within the range of what Eleonora might do, because everything she had ever done in their marriage had been done within the structure of the marriage, within the house, toward the household's continuation and management and presentation to the outside world. She had never, in 16 years, given him any visible reason to believe she was capable of simply departing, simply leaving, simply not being there one morning when he woke at 5:20 and walked to the East Wing. He had been wrong. He had been wrong for a long time, and the wrongness of it was still falling in his chest, still finding new depth. He picked up the first page. He read it straight through this time, without stopping. Then he read the second, and the third, and the fourth. He read all 4 pages without putting them down, and when he finished the last sentence, he sat without moving for a very long time, holding the pages in his hands with the particular stillness of a man who has received a blow he did not see coming, and is waiting to understand fully what has happened to him. Edmund knocked and entered before Frederick spoke, which was something Edmund had done only twice before in 20 years, both times in genuine emergencies. He looked at Frederick's face and stopped just inside the door, and stood there without speaking, reading the room with the accuracy of a man who has spent 20 years learning to read this particular room. Frederick said, "Close the door." Edmund closed it. Frederick said, "The contact in Zurich. I need it done today. I need someone watching the arrival platforms at the main station today." Edmund said, "Yes." Frederick said, "No one outside the household is to be told anything, not a word to anyone." Edmund said, "Of course." He paused with the brief pause of a man who has one more thing, and is deciding whether it is the right moment. He said, "Is there anything else needed?" Frederick looked at him. He looked at Edmund in the way he rarely looked at anyone, which is to say he looked directly, without the management of expression he normally maintained. He said, "Not at this moment." "Thank you, Edmund." Edmund left. Frederick put the 4 pages on the desk in front of him. He arranged them in order, first page to the left, fourth to the right, all 4 visible at once. He looked at them the way he looked at maps and accounts, with the full and deliberate attention of a man who processes complex things by looking at all of the available evidence simultaneously. He read them again, all 4 pages, more slowly this time. The letter was not what he had expected. Somewhere in the back of his mind, in the part of it that prepares for opposition in any form, he had expected a list of grievances, a set of accusations, however elegantly stated. He had expected to find an argument against him, and had been preparing, in the part of himself that always prepared, some manner of response. There was no argument. There were no accusations. There was something considerably more difficult to receive, which was a clear and precise and completely honest account of what had happened between them, written from inside the experience of someone who had been paying close attention for 16 years, and who had arrived, after that sustained attention, at conclusions that were hard to dispute. He looked for the places where he could dispute them. He did not find any. The first page and a half was the love. She had written it without softening, and without excess. In the direct way she wrote everything she believed without qualification, and the detail in it stopped him precisely because it was particular. It was not the general description of how a marriage had felt. It was Eleonora describing specific things, the Venice journey, A conversation about a book she had been reading in the autumn of 1908, the morning in their third year of marriage when he had come to her sitting room to think through a problem, and she had helped him, and he had afterward told her she was right. He had no specific memory of the book conversation. He believed it completely, because she would not have invented it. The morning in the sitting room he had a faint memory of, but had not thought about again in perhaps a decade. She had kept it in all the years between, had held it as evidence of something that had once existed between them. He sat with this for a long time. He read the paragraph about the first loss. Plain language, careful language, the language of someone who has given the matter a great deal of thought over a long period, and has decided exactly what needs to be said, and nothing more. She did not accuse him of cruelty. She described what she had needed and what she had received, which were so different from each other that the difference required no further comment and made none. He read about the second loss. 25 minutes in the chair by the window, the door that made almost no sound. He remembered this. He had believed, at the time, that he was managing the situation correctly. He had believed he was being present. He had stayed 25 minutes. He had said the right things. He had understood it as an adequate performance of what was required. Reading it now, in her account of it, he understood with sudden and complete clarity that a performance of what is required is not the same thing as actually being there. He had been in the chair. He had not been there. He read the part about the third loss and stopped entirely. He had not known about a third. He sat with this for a considerable time, the knowledge that there had been a third, that it had happened while he was in the house, that she had gone through it without telling him, that she had made the decision not to tell him, and that the reason for that decision was written here, in simple, reasonable language, that he could not read his way around. She had not believed it would be worth what the telling would cost her. He looked at the window. The morning was going on outside. Clouds moved across the mountains. He was sitting very still. He read the part about Vienna. One sentence. Written in the same tone as everything else in the letter, which was the tone of honesty applied with complete self-discipline. No edge to it. No attempt to wound. Just a fact recorded as part of the honest account of what the marriage had been. He put that page face down on the desk for a moment. Then he turned it back over and read the sentence again. He did not look away from it. He read about her plans. He read about what she had arranged, in what order, across what period of time. He read the words 14 months, and put the letter down, and sat and thought about what 14 months meant, where they had been 14 months ago, what the estate had been doing, what he had been doing, who had been at meals, what the household had looked like. October 1920. That was where the preparation had begun, Edmund had said, and she had been here the entire time. He thought about this. He picked up the last page. He read the final line, which he had already read once, and which he read again now, more slowly, and with more complete attention than he had given to any sentence in many years. You are not a cruel man, Frederick, but you made a cruel life, and I cannot stay inside it. He read it 3 more times. Then he put all 4 pages down on the desk, and pressed both his hands flat beside them, and looked at the windows, and at the gray March morning beyond them, and at the estate that he had managed his entire adult life with such focus and such efficiency, and he thought about what it meant to make a cruel life without meaning to, and whether meaning not to was any kind of answer to the fact of having done it. He was sitting very still. Outside the study, somewhere down the corridor, he could hear the household in the ordinary business of a Thursday morning. Agnes's voice below in the kitchen, George's footsteps crossing the entrance hall. Somewhere distant, the sound of a door. He reached inside his coat. He folded the 4 pages carefully along their original folds, and put them back in the envelope, and held the envelope in his hands for a moment. Then he put it inside the breast pocket of his coat, against his chest, and pressed his hand flat over the pocket for a moment, and left it there. He called Edmund and told him to double the effort in Zurich. He was not ready for whatever came next. He knew this, and he told himself so, because he was a man who had always told himself the truth about difficult things, even when the truth was not useful. He was not ready. The letter had told him something true and important about what he had been, and what the marriage had been, and the distance between who he had believed himself to be this time yesterday, and what the letter described was a distance a man could not cross in one morning in March. He would cross it. He intended to cross it. He was already, in the slow, unmistakable way of a man who does not back away from things, beginning to cross it. But not this morning. This morning he had to manage the estate and instruct Edmund, and not let any of what had happened in the past 3 hours appear on his face. He had become very good, over the years, at not letting things appear on his face. He used that skill now. He put his hand flat over the letter in his breast pocket once more. Then he went to work. He read the letter again that afternoon, and again that evening, and in the earliest hours of the following morning he woke in his study chair, with the pages held against his chest, and the fire burned down to ash, and the lamp still lit, and for a moment, in the space between sleep and being fully awake, he did not know where he was, and then he did, and then the weight of it was there again, full and complete and unchanged. He had slept in the chair. He had not meant to. He had sat down at perhaps 11 to read through the letter once more, with the composed attention he was trying to bring to it, the methodical and precise attention that he brought to anything whose meaning he needed to fully understand, and at some point between the second page and the third, the exhaustion of the day had taken him. He was still wearing the coat with the letter in the breast pocket. He pressed his hand over it for a moment, a gesture he was beginning to notice in himself without being able to stop it, and then he got up and went to the window and looked out at the dark grounds of the estate. He was trying to understand the love section. He had returned to it more times than to any other part of the letter, more even than to the last line, which he had also read many times. The love section was the first page and a half, written before everything else, placed first deliberately. She had put it first because it was true, and because she wanted him to know it was true before he read anything else. He understood this. He understood the choice and the intention behind it. What he was trying to understand was the specific things she had named. The Venice journey, he remembered well. He had arranged it in the second year of their marriage, and he had arranged it because she had mentioned, once, in October, that she had always wanted to see Venice, and in January of the following year, he had made the arrangements without telling her. He had done this, and had considered it, at the time, a practical expression of attention and care, a way of demonstrating that he had listened, and that the listening had produced action. He had been proud of it, in the quiet way he was proud of things he had done, that he considered well done. What he had not understood until reading her description of it in the letter was what the gesture had meant to her, which was not what he had meant by it. What he had meant by it was, "I heard you, and I have produced the result." What she had received, reading it now in her own words, was, "He keeps what I say. He takes what matters to me, and holds it. He sees me." He had thought about the result. She had thought about the looking. He spent a considerable time with this distinction. The conversation about the book in 1908, he did not remember. He searched his memory with some effort, and could not find it. This troubled him in a way that the specific content of what she had described troubled him less than he might have expected, which was that she could describe a conversation from 1908 in enough detail that he had no doubt it had happened exactly as she said, and he could not recall it at all. She had kept it across 13 years. He had not retained it past the day. This too was part of what the letter was about. Not any accusation she made, but simply the record of what had been kept and by whom. He made a fire in the grate himself, which was something he had not done in years, and he sat in the chair by the fire with the 4 pages on his knees, and read the letter from the beginning one more time. The part about what loving him had cost. She had written this section with the same care she brought to everything, without bitterness, without exaggeration, without the particular indulgence of a person cataloging injuries for the satisfaction of the catalog. She wrote it as a record, as information that she believed he should have, and she wrote it in the manner of someone who had spent a long time thinking about exactly how to say a difficult thing correctly, and had arrived at the correct version. She wrote about the loneliness. Not the word itself. She did not use the word, but the thing itself, described specifically. The suppers alone, not occasional, and not extraordinary but frequent and increasing, 3 or 4 evenings a week. The conversations that happened around the edges of what actually mattered, and never arrived at the center. The years of managing the household, and the accounts, and the social calendar, and the staff, and the guests, without ever being asked what she thought about any of it, without ever being included in the decisions that concerned the estate, and therefore her life, without any consultation, except when the question was practical, and her particular capability made her input efficient. She had been a capable person in a house that used her capability without acknowledging it, and this had been one of the costs. He had known she was capable. He had used it. He had not, he understood reading it, ever acknowledged that it was something she possessed, something she had developed, something that was hers, and that she was choosing to give. He had received it the way he received the functioning of any efficient system, with satisfaction at the result and no particular thought about the mechanism. He read the line about being managed rather than known, and this stopped him. She had written, "I spent 16 years in a house where I was regarded as a function of it. I was not often a person to you, Frederick. I was the household. I was the dinner table. I was the occasion. I was occasionally useful for specific purposes when the situation required it. But I was not, in the ordinary hours of the ordinary days, a person whose interior life was of interest to you." He put the page down and sat with this. He thought about the specific accusation, interior life. He thought about what he had known about Eleonora's interior life. He thought about whether he could, sitting here with the fire and the early morning dark outside and 16 years of marriage behind him, describe what she thought about, what interested her, what she was afraid of, what she had believed when she was young, what she had hoped for. He could not describe most of it. He knew that she read. He knew that she was intelligent. He knew that she managed things with exceptional ability. He knew her opinions on certain specific matters because she had occasionally been asked for them and had given them with the precision he had appreciated for its utility. He knew the surface of her, the professional surface, the Duchess of Harstein surface. He did not know, he understood now, very much about what was below it. She had been below the surface for 16 years, and he had not looked. He read the paragraphs about the losses again. He had read these many times, and each time they were harder, not easier to read. He had told himself, in February 1919, that he had done what was required, that he had said the right things, and been present, and had given her the appropriate response. Reading about it in her account, with the specific detail of what those 2 nights had been for her, what the doctor had said, what Clara had done, the particular quality of what it was like to go through something that devastating, without anyone at your side who had the slightest idea of how to be with you. He could see with complete clarity that what he had provided had been technically correct and humanly insufficient. The door that made almost no sound, she had noticed that. She had noticed it specifically enough to record it years later. He thought about this, that the sound a door made when a man left a room was something a woman remembered when she was writing the most honest account of her life that she would ever write. He thought about what the sound of a door meant, what it meant when someone left a room that way, without noise, without ceremony, closing the door on something rather than simply leaving. He thought about what it meant when the most significant sound in the room was the near silence of a departure. He read the section about Vienna. He read it several times. There was nothing to be done with this section except to read it and not look away, which was what he did. She had named it once, and with absolute restraint, and the restraint itself was a kind of judgment, the kind that says, "I am not going to do to you what you have done, which is to make this about what I need, rather than what is true." He had not been careful with her. He had not been attentive. He had not seen her as a person who deserved his full honesty and his full presence and his full consideration, because she was a person whose inner life mattered. He had seen her as a function. He had not meant to. He had done it anyway. He read the last line again. "You are not a cruel man, Frederick, but you made a cruel life, and I cannot stay inside it." He sat with this sentence for a very long time on the second morning. He had read it many times now, and each reading gave him something new. Not because the sentence changed, but because he was changing. Slowly, in the way that difficult truths work their way into a person who is not avoiding them. "You are not a cruel man." She meant that. He believed she meant it. It was the most complicated part of the sentence, because it was offered as a kind of mercy, not an excuse, not a defense, but an honest concession that the harm had not come from malice. It had come from something harder to name and possibly harder to fix, which was the specific blindness of a man who had decided, in the aftermath of great losses, that efficiency was sufficient, and that the people closest to him would manage on the warmth of the early years and the practical security of the later ones. They had not managed. She had managed, in the way she managed everything, which was alone, and with great competence, and with the cedar box under the bed. But she had not been able to live inside it indefinitely. The cedar box and its contents, all those years of careful, truthful private writing, were in her hands, in a carriage, on a mountain road, at 3:30 in the morning, and she was on her way to Lyon, and he was sitting in a study chair, with an empty coffee cup, and a fire that had gone cold, and 4 pages of cream paper that were the most honest thing anyone had ever given him. He got up, he put the fire right, he went and washed his face in cold water, and dressed properly, and went downstairs, and ate breakfast, for the first time, in 2 days, because there were things to be done, and people who depended on the estate being run, and the estate would not run itself. He was going to do all of it. He was going to manage the estate, and meet with Edmund, and address the correspondence, and deal with everything that needed dealing with. And he was going to carry the letter in his coat. He was going to carry it every day, because it was the truest thing in his possession, and because he needed it close by, until he had understood every word of it, and he suspected that understanding every word of it was going to take considerably longer than 2 days. He pressed his hand over the breast pocket. He went to work. Edmund arrived at the study door at 8:30 on the morning of the 16th, with a face arranged with particular care, which was how Frederick knew the information he was bringing was significant. He sat down, when Frederick gestured to the chair across the desk, which was something Frederick rarely offered, and which Edmund understood, as an invitation to speak at length, and without concern for brevity. He placed on the desk a sheet of notes he had compiled, written in his neat and minimal hand, and he began. The Zurich account had been opened in November 1920, he said. It was held in the name of Eleonora Vasile. The initial deposit had come from a trust account in Bucharest, a trust held in Eleonora's name, established prior to her marriage under the terms of her mother's estate. Edmund paused at this point and looked at Frederick and said, "The trust predates the marriage by 11 years. It was never transferred into the Harstein estate accounts." Frederick said, "I know." Edmund said, "The amount transferred to Zurich in November represents approximately 2/3 of the trust's current value. A second, smaller transfer was made in February of this year." Frederick sat without speaking. Edmund said, "There have been 3 additional deposits to the Zurich account since November. 2 from sources I have not yet been able to identify, both of which appear to be European in origin. The third is a payment from an institution in Lyon, France, made in February, which I believe may be an advance against employment." Frederick said, "Employment." Edmund said, "Yes, I have not yet confirmed the institution, but the amount and the manner of the payment are consistent with a professional arrangement rather than a personal transfer." Frederick looked at Edmund for a long moment. He said, "How long has she been planning this?" Edmund said, "Based on what I have been able to establish, and I want to be clear that I do not yet have a complete picture, the earliest evidence of deliberate preparation I can identify is November 1920. But the Zurich account required prior arrangement, and the financial transfers required prior correspondence with the solicitor in Bucharest. I would estimate the planning began considerably earlier than November." Frederick said, "How much earlier?" Edmund looked at his notes. He said, "I believe the planning may have begun as far back as the autumn of 1919, possibly earlier. Autumn 1919. Frederick calculated this without expression. October or November 1919, the month of the second loss. He had been sitting in the chair by the window for 25 minutes without touching her hand, and sometime in that period or shortly afterward, she had begun building the architecture of her departure. He had been sitting in the chair, and she had been beginning to understand what she was going to do. He said, "Continue." Edmund said, "The travel documents are not from any Austrian or Romanian official source I can identify. They were produced in Zurich, I believe, through a private arrangement of considerable quality. This suggests she had a contact in Zurich, or had access through an intermediary to someone who could arrange documentation at this level." Frederick said, "The cousin." Edmund said, "It would be consistent with what we know." Frederick said, "What else?" Edmund said, "The apartment in Lyon was confirmed through correspondence that appears to date from February of this year. I have found no record of her Lyon contacts from any accessible source, but I believe she has at least one person there she was in communication with, regarding both employment and accommodation." Frederick said, "She was going to teach." Edmund said, "It appears so." Frederick sat with this. He had read it in the letter, in the sentence where she said, "I am going to teach." He had read it and moved past it, because there were other sentences that had claimed him more completely in those first readings, and now Edmund was here, confirming it was not ambition, or or a figure of speech, but a fact already arranged, a position already secured, a payment already made before she left. She had been hired. She had left with a job waiting for her. He thought about what it meant to leave a house with a job waiting for you. Not as flight, not as escape into uncertainty. As a deliberate transfer from one established situation to another, executed with complete preparation and no reliance on chance or goodwill or anyone else's cooperation, except those she had specifically recruited and trusted. He said, "Is there more?" Edmund said, "There is one more thing." He paused with the brief pause of a man who is deciding how to say something. He said, "I spoke this morning with Clara." Frederick said, "And?" Edmund said, "Clara knew. She has known, I believe, since approximately the autumn of 1920. She assisted with several of the arrangements. Specifically, she posted correspondence on the Duchess's behalf from the village post office on a number of occasions across the past year. Correspondence that did not pass through the estate's mail." Frederick said, "I see." Edmund said, "Clara has given notice this morning. She said she would like to leave within the week." Frederick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Approve it. Give her a full year's wages beyond her notice. Write her a reference that says everything true about her and leaves nothing out." Edmund nodded. He said, "Is there anything further you need from me today?" Frederick said, "Find me a private inquiry agent based in Vienna or Zurich, someone reliable who has worked in France. I want the best available, and I want references that are verifiable. Cost is not the primary consideration." Edmund said, "I will have names and recommendations by this afternoon." He left. Frederick sat at his desk and looked at the notes Edmund had left behind. The neat, minimal list of what Eleonora had done, in what order, at what cost, over what period of time. He read it the way he read the letter, with complete attention and without flinching from what the evidence showed, because that was the only honest way to read evidence, and he was committed to honesty with himself, even when it was unpleasant. What the evidence showed was a woman who had decided she was leaving and had then done everything necessary to make that leaving permanent, safe, and complete. She had secured her own money. She had established her own identity in its original form. She had arranged her own employment, her own home, her own travel. She had done all of this without asking him for anything, without asking for help from anyone, except a cousin, a solicitor, and a maid, who had chosen, from her own loyalty, to provide it. She had not asked Frederick. She had understood, with the clarity of someone who has been paying extremely close attention for a very long time, that asking Frederick was not something she could rely on. He thought about this with the same precision he brought to everything, and what it told him was something he had not previously been willing to see about his wife, which was how capable she was. He had known she was intelligent. He had made use of her intelligence when it was convenient and had otherwise not thought about it much. But what she had done across these months was not merely intelligent, it was extraordinary. It was the work of a person who was genuinely exceptional, who had executed a departure from an impossible situation, with the discipline and precision of someone planning a complex long-term enterprise, without resources except those she had managed to secure privately, and without allies except those few she had specifically and carefully chosen. She had done all of it alone. He sat at the desk for a long time after Edmund left, holding the note page and thinking about the 14 months. He thought about what it meant that for 14 months she had been here, in this house, walking these corridors, sitting at the dinner table on the evenings he chose to come to the dinner table, managing everything, attending everything, being everything a Duchess of Harstein was required to be, while simultaneously, and without any visible indication of strain, executing the most complex personal enterprise of her life. He had not seen it. He had been in the house. He had been at the table. He had been, in the technical sense, present, and he had not seen it. He thought about this not to punish himself with it, because he was not a man who found self-punishment useful, but to understand it, because understanding it was necessary. He had not seen it, because he had not been looking at her. He had been looking at the estate, at the accounts, at the correspondence, at the practical problems that demanded his attention. She had been in his peripheral vision, functioning correctly, and he had received her functioning as a fact of the environment, rather than as a choice she was making. She had been choosing, every single day, to continue performing her role while building her exit. The self-possession required for this was something he was only now, reading Edmund's notes, beginning to measure accurately. He had thought he knew what she was capable of. He had known a fraction of it. The inquiry agent Edmund recommended arrived at Schloss Harstein the following week. His name was Harold, and he was a quiet man in his middle years, with an unremarkable face that was useful in his profession, and references from 3 clients whose discretion had been confirmed in writing. Frederick met with him in the study and gave him everything Edmund had assembled. He gave him a photograph of Eleonora, one from a small collection that he had always kept on the mantelpiece, and that was now the only photograph remaining in the room since she had taken her mother's from the dressing table. He also gave Harold, in the specific and deliberate language of a man who has thought very carefully about what he is asking, one instruction that was harder to state than any of the others. He said, "Find her, and confirm she is safe. Confirm she has arrived where she intended to arrive, and is in the situation she chose." He paused. Then he said, "Do not approach her. Do not contact her. Do not make her aware that she has been found. If she is safe and settled, and the situation is what she intended, that is all I need to know." Harold wrote this down. He looked at Frederick for a moment, with the professional assessment of a man who reads people for a living. He said he understood. He left. Frederick returned to the estate accounts, to the correspondence, to the management of a large property that continued to require everything he had always given it, regardless of what had happened in the East Wing 2 weeks ago. He managed it. He was efficient about it. He was, as he had always been, effective. He also began, in the evenings now, to read in a different way than he had previously read. He had always been a reader, in the focused, purposeful way of someone who reads what is relevant to the matter at hand. He began now to read things that were not relevant to any matter at hand, things that he had not previously considered worth the time, essays, accounts, philosophy, and, one evening when he found it on the shelf that had always held Eleonora's books, a collection of writings by several women about what it was like to live inside the particular arrangements that society had built for them. He read it in one sitting. He was not a man who found it easy to be wrong. He was, however, a man who had decided many years ago that the difficulty of being wrong was not a sufficient reason to avoid the conclusion, when the evidence supported it. The evidence in the letter supported it. The evidence in Edmund's notes supported it. The evidence in the book on the shelf, which had been Eleonora's book and which said many things he recognized from the letter, supported it. He had been wrong. He had been wrong for a long time, and in the specific ways that the letter described and that the notes confirmed, and that the book on the shelf illuminated with a clarity that did not require him to reach any further for the meaning. He put his hand over the letter in his breast pocket. He went on. Vienna talked. It talked the way Vienna always talked, when something of sufficient quality arrived for its consideration, which is to say thoroughly, with enjoyment, and without particular concern for accuracy, provided the story was interesting. A duchess of one of the old families disappearing overnight, without a word, without a scene, without any of the expected preliminary drama. This was considerably more interesting than the ordinary variety of marital difficulty, which Vienna had a great deal of experience with, and which rarely surprised anyone anymore. The story had reached the city within 3 days. Frederick did not know precisely how, though he could guess. A servant who had spoken to a servant who had spoken to someone in the village, the telephone, a letter sent by someone whose discretion was incomplete. It did not matter how. It mattered that by the end of the 3rd week of March 1921, Frederick von Harstein could not enter a room in Vienna without being aware, from the moment he crossed the threshold, that everyone already knew. He entered a room in Vienna at the end of that 3rd week because it was necessary. There were legal matters to attend to, financial meetings that could not be conducted by correspondence alone, obligations to the estate that did not pause because his personal situation had become complex. The knowledge that the room already knew was immediately confirmed by the particular adjustment that occurred in the conversation when he walked through the door, the slight shift of posture, the rearrangement of faces from one expression to another, the quality of the welcome he received, which was warm and careful, and 1 degree too deliberate to be natural. A man named William, who had been his associate for nearly a decade, and who was, in Frederick's experience, a person who said difficult things directly when they needed to be said, met him in the first minute and said what needed to be said, which was, "I am sorry, and I am here if anything is needed." He said it without management and without the careful inflation of sympathy that makes sympathy into a performance. He meant it. Frederick received it and was grateful for it and said, "Thank you, William." They moved through the business of the meeting efficiently and without reference to any personal matter, which was exactly right, and Frederick was conscious of how much he valued William's ability to make this distinction. He heard them later that same evening, at the reception that was attached to the legal gathering, a social requirement he had decided to meet, rather than avoid, on the grounds that avoidance communicated something, and he did not wish to communicate it. He had stepped into the adjacent room for a moment of quiet, and had found himself standing near the connecting door, when he became aware that two women on the other side of it were discussing him, or rather discussing Eleonora. One of them he knew to be Margaret, whose voice was recognizable from 100 drawing-room occasions, and whose opinion shaped a considerable portion of what was subsequently said about anyone. She said, "She left without even a scene, without any preliminary visible to anyone, which is either the most extraordinary composure or the most extraordinary coldness, and I genuinely cannot decide which." The second woman said, "I can." There was a pause, and Margaret said, "You knew her." The second woman said, "Not well, but I had enough conversations with her over the years to have a fair sense of her. She did not leave because of coldness. She left because she had finished trying, and that is something very different." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The pamphlet is cruel. I want you to know I had nothing to do with the pamphlet." Frederick had heard about the pamphlet. It had been circulating for 2 weeks. He had not read it. William had told him, with direct apology for being the one to describe it, that it was satirical in the particular Vienna way that used wit as a mechanism for cruelty, and that it referred to him as the Duke who did not notice. Frederick had told William he did not need to see it. William had respected this without comment. The second woman said, "The pamphlet is cruel, yes, but I suspect it is also, in some respects, accurate." Margaret said, "That is the worst kind of cruelty." The second woman said nothing. Footsteps moved away from the door, and their voices became indistinct, and Frederick remained where he was for half a minute before going back to the reception. He attended the rest of the evening with full composure. He answered the questions that were put to him with the answer he had settled on, that he preferred not to discuss the matter, and was grateful for people's concern. He said this with enough steadiness that most people accepted it and moved to other subjects. A few persisted, and he found that repeating the statement once more, in the same voice, at the same level of steadiness, was sufficient for those as well. He returned to Schloss Harstein the following morning, and did not go back to Vienna for several weeks. He had dismissed 4 members of the household staff who had spoken to people outside the estate about the Duchess's departure. This was something he did without satisfaction, and without particular anger, simply as a necessary management of information that had already traveled further than it should. He gave each of them an honest reference for their work, and silence about the reason for their departure, and he let them go. Edmund managed the practical aspects of this without requiring further direction. The spring social season had been cancelled. He had sent the necessary letters in the first week after March 15th. The cancellation was expected by those who received it and interpreted correctly, which was that the Duke of Harstein was not attending things, and that no social obligations would be met until further notice. He was not ready to be in rooms where he was the subject, and was expected to manage the experience of being the subject, while simultaneously performing the ordinary social functions of a man in his position. He would be ready eventually. He was not ready yet. He walked the grounds instead. He had always walked the estate in the early mornings, which were the clearest time for him mentally, but the walks had been purposeful, directed toward some observation or inspection that had a practical end. Now the walks were different. Now he walked for the walking itself, which was something he was not sure he had ever done, and he found that it produced a different quality of thought, less focused and more honest. The kind of thinking that happens when you are not trying to arrive at a conclusion, but simply moving through the world, with your mind partially available to whatever presents itself. He walked past the kitchen garden on many mornings. He looked at it differently now, knowing what he knew about the Sunday morning conversation between Eleonora and Arthur. He walked past the east gate. He stood at the east gate one morning for several minutes, looking at the road that went down the mountain toward the railway station in the next town. He was trying to understand something about the moment of departure, not the practical moment, which Edmund had established, but the interior moment. what it had been for her to come through this gate at 3:30 in the morning, with the cedar box in her lap, and the mountains enormous in the dark, and the choice made, and the years behind her, and the future, a thing she had built entirely by herself, and was going into alone. He found he could not quite reach it. He could imagine the outline of it. He could not imagine it from the inside. He thought about this, about the limitation of his ability to imagine what it was like to be inside Eleonora's experience, and he understood that this limitation was itself part of what the letter was about. Harold's first report arrived from Zurich in the first week of April. Eleonora had arrived in Zurich on the morning of the 15th of March, as the train information had suggested. She had stayed 2 nights at a private residence that Harold believed to be connected to the cousin Dorothy. She had then departed by rail. Harold had traced her to the French border without difficulty, and had established contacts in Lyon who could extend the inquiry. Frederick read this report once and locked it in the desk drawer, and acknowledged it with a note to Harold, instructing him to continue, and to confirm when she had arrived at a stable location. He received, in the weeks that followed, 2 letters from acquaintances, offering to act as intermediaries in any reconciliation that might be possible. He did not answer either of them. He was not interested in intermediaries, and the use of an intermediary would have required him to have a position that could be communicated through one, and his position was not a position. It was a state of reckoning that he was in the middle of, and that had not yet produced anything he could put into language. He was, in the evenings, reading considerably more than he had ever read. He had found Eleonora's collection of books, and had been working through them with the attention that he brought to anything he had decided mattered. Some of them he found difficult, not because they were poorly written, but because they were well written, and said things he recognized, things that he had not previously had a frame for recognizing. He read essays about women's lives, about the internal experience of managing a household for a man who did not see the management, about the specific exhaustion of being capable, in circumstances that received the capability without noticing the person doing it. He read them slowly, and did not permit himself to rush past the difficult parts. Agnes continued to send something extra to the table on the evenings he ate alone, which was every evening. He received it, and was grateful for it, and said nothing about it, because he did not know how to say it, and also because Agnes's language was food, and she was not expecting a verbal response. What she was doing was an act of loyalty that required no acknowledgement to be sustained. Edmund came to him at the end of April and said, with the directness that was one of his most consistently reliable qualities, "The estate has 4 decisions pending that need the Duke's attention this week." He laid them out, one by one, practical and orderly. They worked through them together, as they had always worked through such things, efficiently and without waste of time or language. And at the end, Edmund gathered his notes and paused at the door and said, without looking at Frederick, "She was the best mistress of this house in my time here." He did not wait for a response. He left. Frederick sat alone in the study after Edmund had gone, and thought about what had been said, which was not something that required further elaboration, and that did not, therefore, receive any from him. It was true. It was also, he understood, being offered to him as a thing he should have said, a thing he had had 16 years to say, and had not said, and that Edmund was now saying in his place, because the opportunity for Frederick to say it had gone out through the east gate at 3:30 in the morning, and would not return. The second woman in the drawing room at the Vienna reception, the one who had said she left because she had finished trying, was right. He knew this. He had known it before he overheard her say it, because the letter had told him the same thing in slightly different language. She had not left because she had stopped loving him. She had not left in anger. She had left because there was a finite quantity of trying available to any person, and she had given the full extent of hers, carefully, and over a long time, and it had run out. He had made it run out. He had not intended to. He had done it anyway. Harold's second report arrived in May. He had crossed into France and established contacts in Lyon. He was close to a confirmed location. Frederick put the report in the desk drawer with the first one, and went on with the day. Harold came to Schloss Harstein in the 3rd week of June, with his notebook, and his unremarkable face, and a report that was 6 pages long, and Frederick read it at his desk while Harold sat across from him in the chair that was Edmund's usual chair, and outside the windows the estate was in the particular green of early summer, the kind of light that suggested order and continuation, and that had nothing in it to reflect the nature of what was being read inside. The report was thorough. Harold had traced Eleonora to Lyon without difficulty once he had established the right contacts in the city. She was teaching at a private academy for young women, a secular institution run by a woman named Catherine, who was by Harold's account a capable and well-regarded figure in the city's educational life. The academy occupied a building near the river. The students were between 15 and 20 years of age. Eleonora taught literature and French composition. She had been there since the first week of April. Harold described the apartment. A ground floor flat in a quiet street, small but well-maintained, with a window box in which she had arranged flowers. Harold's contact had mentioned the window box specifically, as evidence that she had settled in, had made the space her own. She walked to the academy in the mornings. She kept regular hours. She had been observed at a weekly market near the apartment, purchasing vegetables and bread, speaking with the market sellers in French, with the ease of someone who was not being treated as a foreign visitor. She ate supper sometimes alone, and sometimes with Catherine, and occasionally with a small group of colleagues from the academy. She appeared to be in good health. She appeared, Harold's report concluded, to be content. Frederick read this word and stopped for a moment. Content. He read it several more times. He looked out the windows at the summer estate and thought about what content meant, what it required, what its presence in Harold's report told him about the past 3 months, about the life Eleonora had built in the time since the carriage went through the east gate at 3:30 in the morning. She was content. She was teaching. She walked to work in the mornings and bought her vegetables at the market, and had flowers in the window box, and ate supper with colleagues who were becoming something like friends, and she was content. She had gone to the city she had chosen, to the work she had arranged for herself, under the name she had been born with, and she had built a life in the space of 3 months that sounded, in Harold's careful language, like exactly what she had planned it to be. He said to Harold, "Is there anything in what you observed, or in your contacts reports, that suggests she is in any difficulty, or that the situation she is in is not one she chose freely?" Harold said, "Nothing. Everything I have been able to observe and confirm suggests the opposite. She appears to be exactly where she intended to be," Frederick said, "and she has not been made aware that any inquiry has been conducted." Harold said, "No, there is no indication she is aware." Frederick sat for a moment without speaking. He looked at Harold's face, which was giving him exactly the information it had been paid to give, and no more. He said, "Thank you. I need some time to consider the next steps, and I will be in touch." Harold left. Frederick sat at his desk for a long time after he was gone. She was content. He had sent Harold to Lyon to confirm that she was safe, that the situation was what she had intended, and the confirmation had come back complete and unambiguous. She was safe. She was settled. She was content. He had the answer to the question he had sent Harold to answer. He had spent 11 weeks and a considerable sum of money on the finding of it, and it was here in 6 pages of careful professional language, and it said, "She is fine. She is more than fine. She is where she meant to go, doing what she meant to do, and she is content." He thought about what to do with this information. He went to his writing desk that afternoon and took out the cream writing paper and wrote her a letter. He had been thinking about whether to do this for several weeks, turning it over with the deliberate attention he gave to decisions of genuine significance, examining it from multiple directions, identifying the risks. The risk in this case was not difficult to identify. She had told him she hoped he would not look for her. He had looked for her anyway, because he was not yet able to stop being the kind of man who moved toward what he had lost. And he understood this about himself without pride. He had found her. Now he was considering writing to her. He wrote the letter in 3 drafts. The first was too long and included too much of his own experience of the past 3 months, which was not something she had asked for and which he was not certain she would want. He burned that draft. The second was too short and had the quality of a formal note rather than a genuine communication, and he burned that one too. The third draft he wrote in 1 hour, with the same kind of care and compression that she had used in writing to him, trying to say the true and necessary thing without making more of it than it was. He said, he had read her letter many times. He understood what it said. He was not writing to argue with it, because there was no honest argument to be made, and she had known him well enough to write something that left nothing open to misrepresentation. He was writing because there was one thing he needed to say that he had not said enough in 16 years, and that he wished to say now, and that was this. He was sorry. Not for any single failing, though the failings were real, and he knew it. For the shape of what the marriage had been for her. For the distance between what she had deserved and what she had received. For the 14 months she had spent building her departure in silence, because she had not believed he was someone she could depend upon. He was sorry for all of it. He was not asking for anything. He was not asking her to return, or to respond, or to do anything except receive the apology if she wished to receive it. He addressed the envelope to the Academy in Lyon, care of Eleonora Vasile. He gave it to Edmund, who posted it without comment. He waited. The waiting was its own experience. He had not been accustomed to waiting for things he could not manage or accelerate, and there was nothing he could do about the speed at which a letter traveled, or the speed at which a woman decided whether to read a letter from a man she had left. He went about the estate in those weeks with the same efficiency he had always applied to its management. He met with Edmund. He addressed the correspondence. He made the decisions about the autumn harvest and the ongoing drainage issue on the north field, and the question of whether one of the outer buildings required a new roof or merely significant repair. He was good at all of this, and he did it well. And it was, he found, genuinely useful. Not as a distraction, but because the things he was capable of doing well were things that the estate needed, and performing them correctly gave him the specific grounded satisfaction of a man whose abilities are being used for their intended purpose. He also read, in the evenings. He had found that the habit of reading things that were not directly useful to the estate had given him a different kind of thinking, slower and more thorough, and he had kept at it. He read philosophy. He read history. He found himself reading, occasionally, things that he would not previously have considered relevant to his life, and finding in them things that were directly relevant to his life, which told him something about the previous limits of what he had considered worth his attention. 6 weeks passed. He did not hear from Lyon. The letter came back in August. It came back in the same envelope he had sent, unopened, with a strip of paper folded across the front, on which Eleonora had written 4 words in her handwriting. Please do not write again. 4 words. His name was on the front of the envelope, and she had not opened it. She had looked at the handwriting and known it was from him, and she had returned it unopened, and on the strip of paper folded across the front of his own letter she had written, "Please do not write again." He held it for a long moment. He turned it over in his hands. He looked at his own handwriting on the front of it and at her 4 words on the strip of paper, and he sat very still with this at his desk in the late summer afternoon, holding a letter that was his letter come back to him, and he thought. He thought about what the 4 words meant. They were not angry. They were not harsh. They were simply clear. She had left him a letter in March that had said everything she had needed to say, clearly and completely. And she had not asked for any continuation of the conversation. She had not asked him to respond. She had said what she had to say, and gone. He had responded anyway, because he had needed to, and she was telling him, in 4 words with the precision she brought to everything, that the need to respond was his need and not hers, and that she had not left one situation requiring her to manage his needs only to enter into another one. Please do not write again. He got up and went to find Edmund. He told Edmund to write to Harold and close the inquiry completely. He told him to pay Harold in full and to thank him for his work. He said to do this that afternoon, before the post closed. Edmund said, yes. He looked at Frederick for a moment with the brief, measured expression of a man who understands a great deal and is saying only what is asked. He said, I will see to it now. He left. Frederick went back to his desk. He sat with the returned envelope in his hands. He thought about the 4 words for a while longer. Then he reached into the drawer of his desk and removed the wooden box he had kept there since March, the box she had left behind when she took the cedar box. He had kept it because it was the box from which she had organized her things for 16 years, and because putting it away had felt wrong in a way he had not fully examined. He opened it. It smelled of cedar and of the particular lavender that she had always used. He put his letter inside the box, the envelope unopened, as it had arrived. He put the strip of paper with her 4 words in alongside it. He closed the box and put it back in the drawer. He did not look for her again. This was the hardest decision he made in the years that followed, and it was the right one. He had understood, in the minutes after the letter came back, what the 4 words meant in their full dimension. That looking was itself the problem. That his continued looking was the same kind of error as all the other errors the letter had described. The error of making his own need the central consideration. She had asked him not to approach her, and he had approached her, because he had needed to, and she had sent his letter back. She was telling him that his need to do something was not, by itself, sufficient reason to do it. She had told him this in the letter she left in March, in the shape of every page of it. She was telling him again, in 4 words, in August. He stopped. He lived with the stopping. He lived at Schloss Harstein through the autumn and winter of 1921, and into the following year, managing the estate, and the accounts, and the continuing decline of the family's financial position, with the same steady competence he had always applied to it. He went to Vienna when required. He met with lawyers and financial advisors. He was not a figure of particular sympathy in the rooms he entered. The pamphlet had done its work, and Vienna had a long memory for that kind of thing. But he was not treated with open cruelty either. He was treated with the careful consideration given to someone whose situation was both interesting and delicate, which he managed with the composure he had always been capable of sustaining for any length of time required. William remained a steady presence. He said useful things on the occasions they met, and nothing beyond them, which was exactly right, and Frederick valued him for it. Edmund remained. Edmund had been offered a position at another estate. He mentioned it once, briefly, to be transparent about it, rather than to negotiate, and Frederick had said simply, "I hope you will stay," and that had been the whole of the conversation about it, and Edmund had stayed, which told Frederick something he had needed to know. The financial situation reached its conclusion in 1924, when it became clear that Schloss Harstein could no longer be sustained under its current arrangements. Frederick negotiated the sale with the same precision and restraint he had given to everything in his life, and the estate went to a family who would manage it. He watched it go without the grief he had expected to feel, or perhaps the grief was present, but was smaller than expected in comparison to the other things he had been carrying since March 1921, which gave it a different scale. He moved to an apartment in Salzburg, which was quiet and manageable, and sufficient. He took with him his books, his correspondence, his coat with the letter in the breast pocket, and the wooden box from the desk drawer, which he placed on a shelf where he could see it from the chair where he sat in the evenings to read. He read a great deal in Salzburg. He walked. He thought with the particular quality of thought available to a man who has stopped being busy for the first time in his adult life, and who has discovered that the silence, rather than being uncomfortable, is full of things he had not previously had the time or the willingness to hear. He thought about Eleonora, not with grief, exactly, and not with regret in the way that regret is usually described, which involves wanting a different outcome. He had wanted a different outcome for a long time. At some point in the Salzburg years, the wanting had resolved itself into something quieter and more honest, which was simply the clear knowledge of what had happened, and what it meant, and what he had been, and the decision to be, from this point, a different kind of man from the one the middle years of his life had made him. He was not sure he entirely succeeded. He thought he partly did. He carried the letter and thought about what it said, and was a man who read and walked and was kind, in a quiet and unremarkable way, to the people he encountered. He thought that perhaps this was the best that was available to him, and he found, in the end, that it was enough. He put his hand over the letter in his breast pocket. He went on. Catherine was explaining the difference between what a story says and what a story means, when the autumn light came through the academy windows, at an angle that caught the dust in the air above the students' heads, and made the whole room look, for a moment, as though it were filled with something luminous, and Eleonora, who had been watching Catherine teach for 3.5 years, and still found it genuinely pleasurable, felt something in her chest that she had learned, in Lyon, to identify correctly. It was happiness, quiet, and specific, and real. She had not trusted it at first, when it arrived in the early weeks. She had been suspicious of it the way you are suspicious of any sensation that has been absent long enough that you have stopped expecting it, checking it the way you check a candle flame in a draft to see if it will hold. She had waited to see if it would dissolve in the first difficult week, the first bad day, the first cold Sunday afternoon in the apartment, when the loneliness was more present than usual. It had not dissolved. It had settled instead into something steadier, more durable, the way things become when they are genuine, and given time to establish their own foundation. She had been in Lyon for 3 years and 7 months, on this particular morning, in November 1924, And she was a different person from the woman who had come through the east wing door, with the cedar box under her arm at 3:30 in the morning. Not entirely different, she was still herself, still the woman who thought carefully about everything, and spoke precisely, and managed her own interior life, with the discipline she had developed across many years of needing it. But different in the way a person becomes different when they are permitted, for the first time in a long time, to simply be who they are, in the place where they are, without having to produce a performance for anyone. She had arranged flowers in the window box of the apartment on the first morning she arrived. She had done it before unpacking, which she had not planned, and which surprised her when she found herself doing it, standing in the small flat, with her bag still on the floor, and a bunch of flowers she had bought at a market stall near the station, arranging them in the box outside the window. She had stepped back and looked at them, and felt something release in her, that had been held for a long time. The apartment was small. The walls were old plaster. The kitchen was narrow. She had made it into a home, and the making of it had given her a pleasure she had not anticipated, the choosing of small things for the first time, entirely according to her own preference, the arrangement of books on shelves that were her shelves for the first time in her adult life, the discovery that she had opinions about a rug and a lamp, and a particular arrangement of the writing desk that she had previously never been in a position to simply act on. Catherine had been the first real friend, and the word real was important. Eleonora had known plenty of women across her years at Schloss Harstein, had maintained cordial and often pleasant relationships with women in the neighboring estates and in Vienna, had been an excellent guest and hostess and conversationalist and acquaintance. What she had not had, in all those years, was a friend who said the true thing and received the true thing back, without management or diplomatic softening on either side. Catherine was brisk and practical, and very funny, in a dry way, that Eleonora had recognized immediately as the humor of someone who has thought carefully about the world, and found it simultaneously serious and absurd. They had become friends across the first weeks of the autumn term, over the specific business of the classroom and the challenges of teaching certain texts to young women, at the exact age where a book could either ignite something permanent in them or produce indifference for a decade, depending entirely on how the introduction was managed. They had argued about a particular novel and the correct approach to teaching it, and the argument had been direct and engaged and conducted without social softening on either side. And at the end of it, Catherine had looked at Eleonora with an expression of genuine pleasure and said, "You are not afraid of a real disagreement. Good. I have been looking for someone who is not afraid of a real disagreement." They had supper together most Friday evenings, sometimes with colleagues from the academy, and sometimes with Catherine's broader circle, which was large and varied and made up of people who were interested in things and willing to say what they thought about those things, which was a quality of company that Eleonora found she had been without for a very long time, and that she fell into with something close to relief. She had forgotten, or perhaps had never fully known, what it felt like to be in a room full of people who were simply talking, without the management of position and reputation and social consequence that had structured every conversation she had been part of for 16 years. She discovered she had a great deal to say, in rooms where the saying of it was welcomed. She had not known how much she had been not saying. She taught literature and composition, and eventually, as the academy grew and Catherine's reputation expanded, history of language, a subject she had not expected to teach, and that she found she loved, in a way that surprised her with its depth. She was good at the teaching. She had known she would be capable at it, because she had been capable at most things she undertook, but the specific quality of the goodness was different from what she had expected. It was joyful. She enjoyed the room, and the particular problem of the student who was not yet convinced that the text had anything to offer her, and the specific pleasure of finding the approach that changed that. She enjoyed the conversations that extended past the lesson into the corridor, young women who had questions they had not expected to have, and who were working out where to put them. The cedar box was on the shelf above her writing desk. She had kept it from the morning she arrived, and she kept it through all the years that followed. The letters inside it were the letters she had arrived with, her mother's letters, Dorothy's, several from people who had written to her with genuine warmth over the years, and the journal, which she had kept across the years of the marriage, and which she had not added to since leaving, because she was no longer building a case. The case was complete. She was living its conclusion. Dorothy came to Lyon twice, in 1922 and in 1925, and these visits were occasions of real pleasure. Dorothy was the kind of person who asked direct questions and genuinely wanted the answers, and who understood Eleonora well enough to read the answers accurately. She saw the apartment, and the window box, and the academy, and Catherine, and the market, and the particular quality of Eleonora's life in the city, and she said, on the last evening of her second visit, drinking wine at the small table by the window, "You look like yourself." Eleonora said, "I know." Dorothy said, "I mean it as precisely as it sounds." Eleonora said, "I know that too." She wrote the book across 3 years, 1926 to 1929, in the early mornings before the academy hours, at the writing desk with the cedar box on the shelf above her, and the lion light coming in from the east. It was a collection of essays about women's education, about the relationship between language and the capacity for an independent life, about the specific things that literature could give a young woman that nothing else could give her in quite the same way. Catherine read every draft and argued with the parts she thought were wrong, which was the most useful form of editorial assistance Eleonora had ever received, and said when the final version was complete, "It is excellent. I disagree with your third chapter, and it must be published immediately." It was published in the autumn of 1929. It received the attention of a book that is genuinely good, but not broadly known, steady and real, reaching the people for whom it was most useful, producing correspondence from women whose names were serious names in the relevant circles, producing occasional notices in the kinds of journals that paid attention to such things. She received letters about it that she answered with care, and that occasionally became correspondences that were, in their own way, a form of friendship conducted at a distance. She was not famous. She did not seek to be. She was read, which was what she had intended, and the reading produced the effect she had hoped for, which was that someone somewhere picked up a book and understood something they had not understood before, and carried the understanding into the rest of their life. This was sufficient. This was, in fact, more than sufficient. It was the kind of thing she had not believed she would be able to do with her life, in the years when she had not been free to do it, and doing it now, in her middle years, with her name on the cover as Eleonora Vasile, produced a satisfaction that she did not find words for, and did not try to. She was in the classroom one November morning, in 1934, when Dorothy's letter arrived, and she did not read it until the afternoon, when the academy day was done, and she was back in the apartment, with the late light coming through the window. Dorothy's letter was brief and kind. It said that Frederick had died in Salzburg, of a failure of the heart, in December. He had been 58 years old. She sat with the letter for a long time. Catherine came that evening for their Friday supper, which happened every week regardless of the season, and found Eleonora at the table with the letter and a glass of wine, and the specific expression of someone who is in the middle of something that requires sitting with, rather than resolving. She sat down. She poured a glass of wine from the bottle on the table. She waited. Late in the evening, Eleonora said, "The man I was married to has died. In Salzburg. Last week." Catherine said, "I am sorry." Eleonora said, "He was not a cruel man. That is the true thing about him, the thing I believed when I wrote his letter, and that I still believe. He was not capable of cruelty. He was capable of something harder to name, which is the damage that comes from complete inattention to the things that matter most. He did not attend to me. He did not attend to what I needed, or what I was feeling, or what the marriage was costing me. He attended to the estate, and to his responsibilities, and to what was in front of him, and he managed all of it very well, and I was not in front of him, and so I was not attended to." Catherine said, "And did he ever understand this?" Eleonora said, "I think he did, eventually. I think the letter I left him made it unavoidable, and I think the man who existed at the end of his life was a different kind of man from the one in the middle of it. I believe this. I cannot confirm it, but I believe it." Catherine said, "Is that enough?" Eleonora thought about this for a moment. She said, "It is what is available, and yes, I think it is enough." They sat for a while longer with their wine, and the lion night was outside the window, and Eleonora thought about Frederick, who had remembered in October something she said in June, and had arranged a journey to Venice in January, and who had sat for 25 minutes in a chair by a window in November 1919 without touching her hand. She thought about both of these things simultaneously, the man who had done one, and the man who had done the other, and she thought that this was what a person was, the full inventory of what they had done and chosen and failed to do, and that the inventory was never simple and never arrived at a single verdict. She had left him, and she did not regret it. And she also held some warmth toward the man he had been in the best of it, and the man she believed he had been trying to become at the end. And she could hold all of these things at once, because they were all true. She thought about this, and found it was not complicated. It was simply complete. She lived in Lyon for 13 more years. She went on teaching until 1945, when she was 61, and the war had reduced the academy to a version of itself that was smaller and less certain, and still doing real work with the young women who came to it. She taught through all of the war years, through the occupation, and through the specific difficulties of maintaining any kind of educational institution in those conditions, and she did it with the same methodical and genuine commitment she had brought to everything that mattered to her. She wrote 2 more books, smaller than the first, and, she believed, better, sharper, and more direct, written by someone who had had more time to understand what she was saying. They were read. They produced the same quality of correspondence as the first, the letters from women who had found something useful in them, and she answered every one of these letters, because she believed that a reader who takes the trouble to write deserves the acknowledgement that the writing was received. Catherine died in the spring of 1943, and this was the hardest loss of the Lyon years. Catherine had been the first person in her adult life who had known her fully, and had chosen to know her, and her loss was the kind that changes the texture of daily existence permanently, that leaves a specific shape of absence in the ordinary hours. Eleonora mourned her properly, and for a long time, without management or performance, in the private way she had learned in Lyon, to grieve things that were real. And she carried Catherine the way she carried everything that was true and irreversible, which was as part of herself. She died on an evening in April 1947, in the apartment, in her own bed, with 2 students who had become friends over many years, and one former student who had become a teacher herself, and who had come from Paris, when she understood the illness was going to be the last one. The window box outside had been planted that spring for the 26th time. The Lyon light was on the wall. After she died, the cedar box was opened by a woman who had been asked to manage the personal effects. Inside it were the letters she had kept across the decades, her mother's letters, Dorothy's, Catherine's, from before they knew each other and after, a letter from a student who had written years after graduation, to say that a passage from a book Eleonora had taught her had carried her through something very difficult, and she had wanted Eleonora to know. The journal from the marriage years was there, closed and locked, its key on the same chain she had worn under her collar at Schloss Harstein, and had worn every day since. The travel documents were there, listing her as Eleonora Vasile, widow, which she had kept because they were the first papers in her life that had given her back to herself entirely. There was also, at the bottom of the box, beneath everything else, a single envelope. It was cream-colored, and it had been opened. Inside, it was a folded sheet of paper, with Frederick's handwriting on it. She had read it after all. At some point, in the 23 years between the day it arrived in Lyon and the April evening she died, she had opened the letter she had returned to him, and read what he had written, and she had kept it. She had kept it in the cedar box with the other letters from the people she had loved, which was perhaps the truest and most complete thing that could be said about what existed between them. That she had kept his letter there, among those letters, in the box that held everything she had chosen to carry through her life. The 4 words she had written on the strip of paper, "Please do not write again," were not a closing. They were a boundary, drawn at a necessary moment by a woman who understood exactly what she needed in order to build the life she was building. She had drawn the boundary. She had lived on her side of it, and she had apparently, at some point in the years that followed, decided that reading what he had to say was something she could do, and had done it, and had kept what he had written among the things she chose to hold. Nobody alive knew when she had opened the letter. Nobody alive knew what she had thought when she read it. These things were hers. They had always been hers, and they remained so. She was Eleonora Vasile. She had made a life that was genuinely and completely her own. It had cost her things she had grieved and given her things she could not have imagined from the east wing of Schloss Harstein, in the years when the cedar box was under the bed, and the window was closed, and the mountains were enormous outside. She had opened the window. She had gone through it. She had lived. On the full accounting of it, which was the only kind of accounting she had ever trusted, It had been a good life. Not perfect. Not without its losses, and its hard years, and its long stretches of something that was not yet what she needed it to be. But good. Real. Built by her own hands, in her own name, in a city where the light in the autumn came through the classroom windows and caught the dust in the air and made everything, for a moment, look luminous. That was enough. That was. When the accounting was done and the box was closed for the last time, entirely and completely enough.